assess the significance of Yemen joining the war? I've heard from some American commentators that this could be the most important escalation in the war. But how important is it, and what other things could they actually do as the war continues again to spiral out of control?
It's definitely very important. The United States waged war against Yemen last year, and it failed, and it had to withdraw. Trump had to, declare victory and walk away. So that itself shows how significant Yemen is. And in addition to that, now that the U.S. is engaged in aggression against Iran, they will not be able to focus on Yemen the way they did last year. So that gives Yemen much more room for maneuver. And then you also have the resistance in Iraq, that it is striking at U.S. targets inside Iraq, but also increasingly beyond the borders. And we are still not very much up the escalation ladder. Yemen has joined, but its targets are so far limited. Iraq has been involved for weeks now, but again, it can go much further. There's talk that, for example, the Iraqis may take Kuwait. They could enter the Arabian Peninsula. Excuse me. Yemen, too, could enter Saudi Arabia. And, of course, close the Red Sea or strike Saudi oil facilities. Remember, I'm sure you remember, but during the 7 years of genocidal war against Yemen, the Saudis, with the support of literally the entire world, or at least the West, was bombing Yemen day and night, slaughtering people. The Americans were patrolling the Red Sea, creating a food and medicine blockade. And actually, a former someone who was with the American forces once told me at a conference that he saw U.S. forces. They stop these small boats and they check them, and they saw that they had medicine, like they were importing medicine into Yemen. They would take that medicine and dump it into the sea. That's how, that's the sort of strangulation that they were facing. And even Qatar and Turkey were supporting this genocidal war until the Saudis and the Emiratis created the blockade against Yemen, and then they tilted away. So with all that support, the Saudis failed after 7 years. And ultimately, what brought about the ceasefire was Yemen's powerful strikes on the Saudi oil and gas oil installations. So today, Yemen is far stronger, and it could easily take out Saudi oil installations and cut Saudi imports from the Red Sea completely. So it can blockade the Red Sea. It can strike Israelis. It can strike U.S. assets in the Indian Ocean. But we don't know what weapons they now have. Obviously, during this past year, they've been developing their capabilities swiftly, just like Iran did, just like Hezbollah did. And the West always underestimates. You and I already had this discussion multiple times, how everyone was saying Hezbollah was defeated. Hezbollah was no longer a major force. But now we're seeing that Hezbollah is striking the Israeli regime hard and with great effect. So, and just like Iran too, the war was supposed to end in a day, the first 12-day war. Now during this Ramadan war, the current war, they thought it would end in a day or two. And then when that didn't happen, they thought they'd take out the missile and drone capabilities in a few days. They kept saying they're decreasing the number of attacks by Iran. Now we're seeing after a month, Iran's missile and drone strikes are increasing in effectiveness than before, especially during the last 10 days or so. So this underestimation, this strong tendency for the West to underestimate is something that we're seeing all across the board. They underestimated Yemen, they underestimated Hezbollah, they underestimated Iran, and of course, Iraq. So we don't know what potential Yemen has, but I'm sure it's much greater than what it had before. And therefore, this is not good news for the United States. But the escalation ladder, still, we have a long way to go. If the U.S. escalates, if the Zionist regime escalates, this side will escalate too. It's not a war that the Americans can win. It's not a war that the Israeli regime can win. And as we speak, Glenn, the shortage of energy, the shortage of fertilizer, the shortage of petrochemicals increases literally by the minute across the world. So the pressure from the international community on Trump and the anger towards the Israeli regime and Zionism and Netanyahu builds. So, and of course, the pressures inside the United States, I would imagine, would be building too. So the Iranians know exactly what they're doing. Their allies know what they're doing. And but they haven't yet shown their maximum capabilities. Far from it. They're just trying to manage the escalation. But I think there's no doubt that they have escalation dominance. And you know, Glenn, one thing that I was thinking about just yesterday, I've been thinking about it a number of times during the past week. The United States could have taken a completely different route. About a decade ago, there was a book written called Going to Tehran. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's co-written by Flint Leverett and Hillary Leverett. They were White House. They worked in the White House. Flint was the head of the Middle East in the National Security Council, and Hillary was the head of the Persian Gulf. That's where they met, actually, and married. Hillary is a Jew, Flint is Catholic. You know, they different religions, different backgrounds, in the center of power. And then when they left the White House, they wrote a book on Iran, which is actually a very good book. And it's about why the United States has to come to terms with Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I would advise everyone to read that book, actually. But if the United States had taken that route, we wouldn't be in this critical situation today. We would be in a very different world. But of course, instead of policymakers reading this book and listening to them, they did the exact opposite. They listened to the Zionists, the oligarchy, the Epstein class, and we are in this critical mode. So it's not just Iran. It is the Axis. And now we're seeing the Axis actually show its capabilities from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, Iraq, Iran. The potential is there to create a catastrophe for the United States. Already we're seeing Iraq expelling NATO forces, U.S. forces leaving. A form of liberation is already taking place there. So Yemen's entry into this war, even though it's still not actively participating except for missile strikes on the Israeli regime, its potential is enormous. And if you shut down the Strait of Hormuz and shut down the Red Sea simultaneously, then I think the catastrophe for the West is, I don't think it can be really calculated.
Yeah, what you said about underestimating Iran, I often make the point that this is a common theme against all, essentially, our adversaries or opponents. That is, we always underestimate Iran, we underestimate Russia, we underestimate China. The idea that they can be broken in economic wars or actual wars. It's an interesting phenomenon because it's almost used as a loyalty test that you have to proclaim that they are extremely weak and also exaggerate their threats. And if you fail to do so, then, that is to say that they're all very weak. So obligatory underestimation and also a huge threat. Then if you fail to fall in line, then essentially then that is indication that you're taking the other side, so it makes you a traitor. So it's a very dangerous thing, because even if the goal should be to defeat the Iranians and Russians and Chinese, you don't want to underestimate your opponent. This is a very foolish thing to do. But I did want to ask you a bit about how you see the Iranian interpretation of attacks on it, but also Iran's own targeting, because we spoke before about when the US said it wouldn't attack Iranian energy and then infrastructure, and then the Israelis allegedly attacked the South Pars all by itself. Well, we saw something similar now. That is, Trump proclaimed, we're going to give it a 48-hour deadline until we start attacking. He delayed it extended it to 5, then extended it to 10 days, and suddenly then Israel began attacking at the beginning of this period, the critical industries, the steel industries, for example, of Iran. And the argument was, well, it's only the Israelis. How do you see this, though? Is this just another, diplomatic ruse, or are they joined at the hip? I mean, how do you assess these constant efforts to argue that, we want a de-escalation while at the same time escalating?
Well, I obviously don't have access to what goes on behind closed doors in the United States or among the military staff here. But in general here, the belief is that they are joined at the hip, and that it's impossible. And military analysts in Iran, like retired officers who come on television or write articles online in Iran, they say it's impossible for the Israelis to carry out strikes without full coordination with the Americans, and that this is a joint operation. So the strike on the South Pars gas installation was a test, and the Americans were and the Israeli regime obviously were hoping that Iran would not retaliate, even though it promised that it would be much harder if struck. They tested Iran, and Iran did retaliate in the way in which it threatened to do, and that's what made Trump back off. And then, of course, Trump, as you rightly pointed out, said he's going to destroy Iranian critical infrastructure in 2 days, which is a crime against humanity, and no one in the West seems to care, meaning among elites and in the mainstream media. Just like with Cuba, a sad tale in itself that's also being ignored, the starvation of the Cuban people in order to bring it to their knees so they can take Cuba for themselves. But first he gave 48 hours. Then I think it's clear that he was afraid that Iran would actually carry out heavy retaliation. He did it for the markets, but then he, of course, extended it for another 5 days, which was, again, to control the markets, which was pretty effective that week. It brought the price of oil down considerably. And then 10 days again. He threatened the threat to bomb Iranian critical infrastructure and the Iranian electricity power plants. And that was again extended for 10 days. And that, I think, is basically for 2 reasons, possibly. One is obviously to control the markets, because Iran's retaliation would be devastating for oil and gas and the capability for the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Kuwaitis and the Qataris to export in future. So, because right now, if there's a deal, let's say at some point the Americans meet Iran's demands and it comes to an end and they open the Strait of Hormuz, energy can gradually be exported, and it'll take some time, but a lot of the problems will decrease over a year or so, perhaps. I don't know the details, or I'm not an expert, but if the fighting intensifies, obviously these installations will be destroyed, and therefore opening the Strait of Hormuz at some point would be meaningless. So I think he backed off again. But I think he's also waiting for the extra troops to come in, and then he wants to carry out an assault. It was believed that it's possible that he may carry out the attack during these nights, or that he may wait till the other forces come in, and then possibly he would strike critical infrastructure as he launches attacks to capture Iranian territory. So there are many different scenarios that are being discussed in Iran, but I think that it's clear that if there's escalation on behalf of the Americans, the Iranians are going to escalate. And so just a couple of days ago, when they struck the Iranian factories, the Iranians have been retaliated. They destroyed the aluminum complex, badly damaged it in the Emirates, in Bahrain, and it will continue. Or, for example, they've begun to bomb Iranian universities, and they bombed an important university in Tehran. And so now the Iranians are saying we're going to bomb American universities in the region, American and Israeli universities. So the Iranians, every time they strike back. So that is a deterrence. But again, we don't know where this is going to go, because Trump is constantly changing his opinion. And right after he said we're going to wait for 10 days, he hasn't struck the electrical infrastructure, the electricity power plants, but they are attacking key factories and key infrastructure in Iran. So there's no, and this further strengthens the argument among Iranians that we just can't do a deal with Trump. It's not possible, because he'll say one thing today and he'll do something else tomorrow. Just like the JCPOA, a U.S. commitment, he tore it up. Just like the 12-day war, we were negotiating, but he was secretly plotting against the country. This war, the same, we were negotiating. There was progress. But he was not serious. Now he says, we're not going to strike. And then the Israelis strike. And even if we conclude that the United States is not in control, that's even worse. That means that if they're not in control, then what's the point of having negotiations? Because if the United States is not talking on behalf of the Israelis, if the Israelis are the ones who are in charge, then what's the point in negotiating? So no matter how you look at it, this reinforces the argument in Iran that now is not the time to stop the fighting. The facts on the ground have to change in order for us to feel secure in the future. Because the United States is obviously either unwilling to abide by its commitments, or it's incapable of doing so.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, the extent to which the U.S. is in control, because, you can have two competing hypotheses. That is, either Israel is in the driving seat, that is, it's pushing for the escalation and pulling the U.S. deeper into the war, or the U.S. is just using Israel as a frontman. That is, it allows the U.S. to play the good cop to Israel as the bad cop. So it's hard to know, but I take your point. At the end of the day, that doesn't matter if you can't trust the one you're negotiating with. Hegseth, though, he made this argument that a big strike would soon come, and it seems likely that this will be coordinated by the use of all ground forces to occupy something, whether it's Yemen islands, Iranian islands in the Strait of Hormuz, or the actual Iranian mainland. We don't really know. They could go for Karg Island. It's really unclear at this point. But at the same time, we see that of all the Gulf states, it's the United Arab Emirates which seems to signal the strongest that they will join in on the fight against Iran. I thought this was interesting because the UAE claims these 3 islands of Iran, which Iran took in 1971. And these islands could be critical in the future for the U.S. to control the Strait of Hormuz. So the Americans are saying, we have to control the Strait of Hormuz. The UAE has the islands, or claims to islands, which which would allow the US to do so. Now you see the US talking about ground troops and the UAE seemingly very enthusiastic about joining in the war. So I don't know. I'm speculating, but still, it seems as if there's reasons to believe that going after these islands would be an objective. On the other hand, it's very hard to see how they could actually. I think they could take them, but I don't understand how they can hold them. They would be like sitting ducks, it seems. So I was just wondering, how do you assess the situation? What is the ground troops are coming? How can the Americans use them against Iran?
Well, I think the Emirates really isn't important. None of the Arab regimes in the Persian Gulf are important. They're not capable of fighting. And the Emirates has the citizens of the United Arab Emirates are a bit over 1 million people. That's nothing. Or Qatar, or Kuwait, or Bahrain. And Saudi Arabia, we've already seen that it could not fight against Yemen. And now, the situation being as it is, they cannot fight against Yemen at all, nor Iraq, the Iraqi resistance, or Iran. So it's basically the U.S. What the Arab regimes do is they give the United States the ability to attack Iran. They allow them to use their territory, not just the bases. The Americans are all over the place. And they use their airspace, they use their airfields, their air bases. So that's basically the role that they play. But Iran has said that if the United States assaults Iran's mainland or carries out operations deep inside Iran, because that is also something that Iranians are preparing for. In fact, some believe that this talk about this island or that island may be an attempt to divert Iranian attention, and then the Americans do something else. So Iran is preparing itself, has been preparing itself for 2.5 decades at least. They've been preparing themselves for today. And of course, the Americans miscalculated with the missiles and the drones. So I think they will probably soon find out that they've miscalculated about taking islands and taking Iranian territory, or carrying out commando operations or whatever, special operations deep inside Iran. But time will tell. But the problem for the United States is that even if they do take territory, maintaining it will be the problem. But more importantly, what are they going to do about the oil and gas? All those.
Sorry, sorry to interrupt. You were saying, what will they do about the oil and gas? And then you went away.
Okay, let me do that again.
I'll clip it away.
Okay. But what will they do about oil and gas and fertilizer and petrochemicals? If Iran doesn't control the Strait of Hormuz, first of all, from the shores of the Persian Gulf or the Gulf of Oman, the missile bases and drone bases are hundreds of kilometers deep inside Iranian territory, and there are many of them. And the Americans have already failed to destroy them. There's no reason to believe that they can take out all these bases. And then if the Americans escalate, the Iranians will destroy the tankers. And they'll destroy the oil and gas installations and assets and the other key assets in the Persian Gulf region that belong to these Arab family dictatorships who are complicit. So let's say, hypothetically, the U.S. takes the islands or some territory or carries out some operations against a missile base or a drone base, or with success or failure. Doesn't matter. That's not going to open the Strait of Hormuz. And that's not going to prevent Iran from destroying and retaliating simultaneously. So let's say they're able to open the Strait of Hormuz somehow, which I don't see happening. When there's no oil, when there's no LNG, there's no tankers, what's the point? So the price of oil will go up to $200 a barrel, and then we'll see economic collapse. And this is something that we've envisaged already. Well before this war. I was saying that all this would happen, and $10 to up 100, that's quadruple. That will bring down the economy. Again, these analysts, these mainstream Western analysts, they downplay everything. And by downplaying everything, you can't make it go away. You just miscalculate. Just like with regards to Iran's military strength, just like with regards to Hezbollah, or Russia, as you pointed out, or China, or Yemen and Ansarullah, or the Iraqi resistance. So any U.S. attack on the mainland or on the islands is going to lead to greater disaster, because you'll have further destruction, much greater destruction, and that means that the oil crisis and the energy crisis and the petrochemical crisis and the fertilizer crisis will be permanent.